All right, good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the JavaScript DOM. Now, this is a really cool subject because we're going to learn how to essentially manipulate our HTML document utilizing JavaScript. So here we go, Intro to JavaScript DOM. What we're going to be covering today is what is the JavaScript DOM, writing JavaScript within HTML, connecting an external JS file. We're going to go over the different types of query selectors, the onClick attribute and writing an onClick function. And then in part 2 of our lecture, we'll go over creating and inserting HTML elements with JavaScript, handling events, event propagation, what is it and how do we stop it from happening, and working with HTML forms with JavaScript. Does anyone have any questions over the topics that we'll be covering today? All right. If there aren't any questions, let's go ahead and start talking about the JavaScript DOM. So what is the JavaScript DOM? The DOM stands for Document Object Model. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean anything to me as to what is the document object model. It's cool phrasing, but what does that mean? Well, what that means is essentially every HTML tag within my HTML script is actually can be actually referenced to with JavaScript as an object. So just like we saw in the Poke API, and actually this is good to pull up right now, just like we saw in the Poke API, we can have nested properties inside of an object. All right, so here we see that this object has a key with a list of objects, and they can continue to be nested and so on, right? We could have another object that maybe this has abilities and this has more list of objects and so on. So how does that interpret, or how can I see the same thing when I'm working within JavaScript? Well, or excuse me, when I'm working within HTML. Well, let's take a look here. All right. So here's all of my information. I have my object in itself. Let's take a look at what we can see here. Oh, wow. So it looks like the Poke API developers have a couple of console.log statements that they forgot to comment out. So note to everyone here, make sure that you're commenting out your console log statements before you actually push anything to production. All right. So now we have here the actual document, but how do I grab the document itself utilizing JavaScript? Now, keep in mind, I'm utilizing the JavaScript console here, all right? Well, I can say document, and actually you'll see that that's already highlighting the entire site in itself, right? When I pick the document, it tells me, hey, you're referencing the entire document that I am currently rendering. Okay, well, I can say dot, and it's going to bring up a couple of different attributes or properties as we've referenced to them before. Now, all of these are just key value pairs that belong inside of JavaScript, or that belong to this HTML component, right? So when I'm referencing this document, all I'm seeing in this JavaScript script is I have a variable named document, and it has attributes such as children, which is typically an array. It has things such as location, which is typically a string with the actual location that renders it. URL.com. Let's see what else we can get from our document here. Well, we can see that there's adopt a node. We can grab links and colors. We can append a child. That's going to be really interesting to take a look at later on. It tells me the character set that is currently utilized by this node. But let's take a look at the children. All right. Well, if I pass in document.children and I click enter, well, it returns to me that there is an array with one index named HTML. All right. So that means there is an object here reference to as HTML that is equal to the following. Well, let's open up HTML. And HTML has pretty much the same exact number of keys, if not more. Again, there's a couple of them that we'll actually utilize, such as children. And so again, this repeats over and over again. Each HTML tag will have an attribute of children. At some point, it will turn into null if there aren't any children, I believe. It will either turn into null or it will be an empty array. We can find out here shortly. We can see here that it even gives me, hey, this is the name that was given for the class. So it gives me a class name, which is also a string. So I'm a class. It likely also gives me an ID attribute. I probably just have to look for it. Well, it gives me a whole dictionary for attributes that are being applied as well. There it is. There's our ID. It gives me a couple of first child elements. There's too many of these to actually go over and to specify what exactly they do. Some of these are event handlers. Event handlers are identified by this on property. All right. So now let's take a look at the children that belong to HTML. So I'm going to clear out what I currently have here. How could I get from document all the way down to the HTML children attribute? Can anybody take a stab at that? Oh, my camera has been off this whole time. I apologize, everyone. Go ahead, Muran.
Okay, we're gonna start with the document between. You wanna write it down right here? The how we write it down?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Then we're gonna start with the exclamation mark document,
Okay.
and then the HTML. Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. HTML, and then yeah.
Well, let's stop there, right? If I put document.html, it comes up as undefined.
Why?
Well, let's look at our document here, right? So here's my document object. Is there a key named HTML?
No. Children. Oh, so we children next.
All
So
right.
document dot children.
So document, oh, I can't do that. Document dot
Dot,
children.
yeah.
Okay.
And inside the children dot HTML.
Okay, so let's try that again. HTML. Well, that comes
Undefined.
up undefined as well. All right.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, that was great. So if I put document.children, what do we get here? Oh, there you go. Wow, I can't. I apologize, everyone. We do document.children. Well, that returns to me an array. All right, and I see Brandon Neslodge. That was the last hand I saw up. Nothing? If you're speaking, you're muted.
No, never mind.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, you just do document.children and then the square brackets for index 0 of the array.
Okay, so document.children. Then I could do index 0 of the array. Okay. What's next?
And where do you want to get to after that?
I want to see the children of HTML.
Another 0. Oh no, that's a dictionary. That's a object, so it's dot children.
All right, so I would put dot children. Document is, . All right, so now I'm looking at the children of HTML, and now I get another array that has head, which would also be a dictionary type. It has body, which again would also be a dictionary type. And then it has this iframe stuff that I really don't care about. But we can see how the object model just continues to open up, right? So everything is, oh, let's not do that. Yeah, everything is just a nested series of objects, right? So I have one master object, which is my document. And then from there, everything falls within arrays of objects. Every child that belongs to the document has their own object with their own children, right? Everything's boxes inside of boxes. Now, if I were to turn this HTML document that I see here on my left-hand side into some boxes, just like I said before, well, we start off with my document. That's my entire browser. Within my entire browser, there's got to be an HTML doc that falls almost exactly as the same height as width as my browser, depending on what it is that I dictate. From there, I should have a head, which is not visible. Right, that head element is only for programmers to either change the styling sheet or to do anything that needs to get loaded before the body starts getting loaded. But if I take a look here, I can now have a body. All right, I am deciphering this. And if I were to take a wild stab at this, there's likely a header and a main and a footer inside of that. So let's take a look here. All right, so again, I'm gonna type in document.children. All right, inside of my children, I want to take a look at index 0 for HTML. I then want to take a look at the children there. And I want to take a look at the body, which is at index 1. So now I can pass in children one last time. All right, so there's my HTML collection for the children of my body, which looks massive. It looks like whatever framework they are using is hiding some of the insides of their HTML template. Yeah, it is. All right. So then from here, we could see that the head would be empty. That would have something like, hey, this is the title attribute of X-ray. Here is the link tag, and the link goes to main.css. Inside of my body, I would have a header that would also be an object that would have children. Right, maybe that's all there is in my header. It's just the nav bar. That's one of the childs. Inside of my body, there would be a main for the main content. And this would also have children. And then finally, we would have a footer, which would also have some children. All right. So if I were to take a look at what that looks like here, well, now I've established that I have a header. There is likely a body or a main component, and then a footer. So I just did my entire HTML template is being rendered and recognized by JavaScript inside one massive document, or excuse me, one massive object. Right, so that's why it's a document object model. It turns the document in itself, the HTML document, into a massive object that JavaScript can work with and interact with. Does anyone have any questions regarding to the DOM? How do we understand the DOM and how the DOM works? Go ahead, Momo.
Okay, I understood the DOM. Okay, it's like how you said, the document, the whole page, okay, is object, and there is objects nested inside this object, and there is objects nested inside the object, nested inside the main object. But just I can't imagine how, like, the main object document, okay, the parent,
Mhm.
it has children, right? And also a class name, right? So children will be the children of the parent, that including object, and the class name, this another children, or this is this confusing me. The class name, what the class name relation between, what the relation between class name? Oh, the class name, that's from the children, right?
No, so actually the class name is referencing to the attribute class. So if I were to make a div here, right? So if I say div and I say class, I am a class, and I put some lorem ipsum in there. And I take a look at my JS document here. Well, if I were to do document dot children at index 0 dot children at index 1 dot children at index 0, and I send that through, it would give me this div here. All right, so it's grabbing my div correctly. But I can now also check dot class name. And when I pass in class name, it is another attribute of their object that returns the class that I gave it, which is I am a class. Does that answer your question, Mama?
Yes, sir. So this is not it's just reference to object, right?
Exactly. This is just
Reference yeah, reference to class of object with the name, whatever name of the class. Is this right?
no, you're giving too much meaning to the class here. So this class isn't in reference to any OOP reference or anything like that. This is just saying that I gave it an attribute of class, and the name that I gave it is I am a class.
So okay. So this is not object. Yeah.
Correct. This is not an
It's
object.
it's just referring to object.
Right. This is the key
That
out of the object, and this is the value that's being returned.
okay. Yeah, I got it now. Thank
Awesome.
you.
Brandon?
So the DOM basically turns HTML into an object that JavaScript can manipulate. Does it have anything to do with CSS? And can you manipulate CSS elements with JavaScript as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if I were to use this here, and actually we're going to be covering this later on in the lecture. So the short answer for now is going to be yes, and then I'll demonstrate it later on.
Okay, I had a feeling. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, great. If there aren't any other questions, now that we understand the DOM, let's get into utilizing the DOM. So the easiest way to kind of understand what we're doing here is we're going to actually create a script within our HTML template that will take in an input and then place that input inside of a division. So let's take a look at that. How do we make that happen, right? So again, all I'm going to do is I'm going to accept an input. This is going to be of type text. And that's pretty much it as of now. Maybe I could put a placeholder here. Enter your class name. All right, I'm going to make a button that will trigger this action. And then from there, I'm just going to have a div with a paragraph tag. And let's make sure that our output goes in here. So I'm gonna go ahead and say output. Now this is gonna be kind of like a preview of what we're gonna be doing with JavaScript, right? So currently I have my input field. And actually this input field, I need to grab a name. Oh, I need to have a way to grab this information. So I'm gonna give it an ID as well of input. No, there you go. So now I have a couple of elements here. I have an input field, a button, and a division with output. Great. Well, how do I grab this information, right? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a script tag to my header. So I'm going to say, hey, I want to write a script. Just like before, I could do a style tag to add specific elements. I can say something like div, background color, and let's make it red. Currently, I just have an empty div, so it's not showing it to me. Let me put something here. All right, so there we can see the div showing up with the background color being red. Well, just like I could write a style tag inside of my HTML document, I can also write a script tag, which will allow me to write JavaScript. So now I'm just going to say const, and what I want to do is I want to show a greeting to my current input. I'm simply making a function. Now, this function, typically when I want to see something in the console, I may do something like console.log hello, right? Now, this may work for our scripts that we're writing for our terminal commands, but now I'm dealing with an entire document. So first I need to be able to grab the information that was placed in by the user. Well, in order to grab that, I need to set it to a variable. So I'm going to say let input be equal to document. And now rather than iterating through the entire object, what I can do is I can take a shortcut and I can grab my element by ID. So what's the ID that we gave this element here?
The input name.
Nice. All right, so ID that I passed in was input-name. Now, when that gets triggered, or when I grab that input, that's just going to grab me the HTML value or the HTML input tag. So I need to grab the value within it. So I'm going to do dot value. That will grab the value of text that's within that tag. And actually, before we even do that, let's just console.log input so we could take a look at what's being registered. All right, now I need to wait for this script tag to get executed or this show greeting function to be executed. Well, that's where this button submit comes into play. There is an attribute called onClick that I can utilize to trigger some behavior. What I wanted to do is I wanted to call the show greeting function. So now I'm going to type in here X-ray and I'm going to click on submit. Well, when I click on submit, the show greeting function was triggered because there was an on click on that button. I clicked it, it triggered the show greeting function. And just like I said before, it grabbed the HTML document, which is an input tag with the ID of input name, type text with the placeholder. And that's what was console.log. Now, if I wanted the actual input, I have to put value at the end of that. That is the attribute that I want to grab out of this object. And now we can see that it console.logs X-ray. Great. So now that I have that information, I need a place to store it, which is where the output comes into play. All right, so I can say let output be equal to document dot get element by ID output. This is just going to give me the div tag. Well, how do I place text inside of the div tag? All I'm going to say is output dot inner HTML, and actually I'm going to use inner text here, and I'm going to make that equal to the input. All right, so I'm grabbing the input that is placed inside of the input tag here, which is X-ray. When I click on this function, I'm going to grab X-ray. I am then going to grab the paragraph tag with the ID of output. And I'm going to say, hey, the inner the inner text that's going to be inside of this paragraph tag is going to be equal to the input. And we could actually even make this a little bit fancy. Let's say hello, and go with a little bit of string interpolation. All right, so I'm going to click X-ray, click on submit, and now I get hello X-ray. It was all done through JavaScript. I was able to grab an element by their ID, grab an attribute value. So currently I grab dot value. If it was empty, it would have been just an empty value or an empty string. I then went into my output, grabbed that element, and gave it some inner text, all utilizing JavaScript, right? So I'm making my site more dynamic now. All right, before I continue moving forward, I'm going to open up the floor for questions. I see a question from Cody.
Yeah, quick question. So you defined output as an ID down below, then you reference it above. How does that usually, or how does that work when you typically, compile or run the program from top to bottom?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I did make this function, right? The function was created prior to any of the HTML being populated. But even though the function was created, the function was never called, right? So because the function was never called, all of this is then created, and the function is only called once I click on submit. So at that point, output and input name do exist. If I were to call it up top and say show greeting, just like this as part of my script, and I try to inspect it, we're going to see that there's an error that populates within my console. And it's telling me, hey, this cannot read properties of null, reading value. Well, that's happening because I tried to get an element by ID of input name, which didn't exist yet at this point. Right? And then I try to grab dot value. Well, dot value isn't a property of an object, or value is a property of an object, but currently this is returning null. So when I do dot value, it's telling me this doesn't exist within this property. All right, again, I'm going to comment it out so that it's not executed. I refresh my browser. If I place an X-ray and click on submit, now it's able to grab an object and render the value of said object. Does that answer your question, Cody?
So in body, so does it execute all of the body at once? Because it has ID equals output after the show greeting function call, but then you reference output in your function call.
Got it. This function here, or this function call, is not happening. It reads it and it says, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do once the click happens, but it doesn't call the function until I click down on that button.
Okay, so it generates the body, the whole body, then it already executed that ID equals output. But then when you click it, since it already identified the output there, it has already been, I guess, created, I suppose. I think I'm tracking what you're saying.
Yeah, so essentially the entire HTML document gets rendered, and once I click it, that's when this function comes into play.
Rendered, that's it. All right, thank you. That makes sense.
All right, Momo?
Yeah, very quick question. You said when we want to add the text, okay, and the output, okay, we're gonna make output dot inner text and then the text, okay, that will go to the input, okay, and when we call the function by clicking on the bottom submit, the function will give us the output, okay. You said something about inner text or inner HTML. what the difference? What inner HTML? Is it do the same thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the difference between inner text and inner HTML is inner text is specifically to set text within some sort of tag, but text only, while inner HTML is quite literally to write more HTML within an already pre-existing tag, right? So if I wanted to make this H1 element, right, and I do X-ray and I submit it, it still comes up as text, right? Well, if I do inner HTML and I then submit X-ray, now it comes up as an H1 element. Does that answer your question, Mo?
That's great answers. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Any other questions?
Yes. So could we potentially go over the steps in which the DOM loads? So for example, when a web page actually, like a user navigates to the web page, what is the first thing that triggers? Like what is the steps that the DOM itself takes to load? So does the HTML get read first? Does the JavaScript get read first? What are the steps for that procedure?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, we could cover that right now. All right, so let's go over the steps in which the JavaScript loads here and connecting. Here we go. All right. So the very first thing that's going to happen is the browser is requesting an HTML file. All right. From there, the header gets read by the browser. Only executable code is being executed. Otherwise, it's being stored, right? From there, the body is rendered by the, and I guess I should specify this applies to CSS and this applies to JavaScript. All right, so then the body is rendered by the browser. And then on-click functions are event triggers, meaning the function passed into them is only executed upon said event. All right, so hopefully this helps visualize it a little better. So when I refresh my browser here, the first thing that gets rendered is the first thing that happens is my browser requests an HTML file. Currently, I have forgot the name of it, live server, I'm pretty sure. Currently, I have live server rendering my HTML document. It's currently operating in port 64316. We see it up here, and what's being rendered is index.html. Good. So index.html gets sent to my browser. My browser grabs index.html and starts working from top to bottom. It says, oh, well, this is an HTML tag. We're going to be working with in English. Let's render the head. The character set we're going to be utilizing is UTF-8. Here's the viewport scale that we need. Oh, here's a link to a style sheet. Well, let's come over to the style sheet. The style sheet's empty. None of that's executable code. Cool. Then it goes to the title, JS DOM. That's executable. So before we start rendering anything on the screen, we need to make sure that JS DOM is applied to the tab. Okay. Then it moves down and sees a script tag, but it's looking for executable code within my script tag. Currently, all I'm doing is establishing a variable within memory space. I am not executing a function. I am making a variable or a function variable named show greeting. None of that is being executed. So it looks through it, says none of this is executable, but I know this exists. I'm going to save it as a function. From there, it finishes off the head. All right, moves on to the body and starts actually rendering HTML. We get our input tag with the proper ID and placeholder. We get a button with an onClick attribute that is calling to the show greeting function. I know I have my opening and closing parentheses here, but I'm not actually calling the function yet. This is not going to happen until I click down on that button. Finally, it moves into a separate division that has a paragraph tag with the ID of output. Cool. Then me as a user type in X-ray into my input field there. And when I click on submit, once I click down on this button, it says, well, there's supposed to be a show greeting function that I have to call now. Well, I remember when I read the script, there was a show greeting function. I'm going to grab that function and apply it now. Well, I'm going to grab the input name, which is this input field here, grab the value out of it, which is X-ray. I'm going to grab this paragraph with the ID of output, and I'm going to change its inner text to hello input. And that's how we get hello X-ray being rendered on the browser. Does that answer your question, Brandon?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. Momo?
No, I'm sorry. This is from the. I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. Chris?
Yes. So I see how we can put a JavaScript in HTML. Can we put HTML into a JavaScript file and let it do the same thing as a HTML file, or no?
We're going to be covering that in later on lectures, but your short answer is yes.
Gotcha.
All right. So now we have this information. We're up to speed. We understand how this is working. But again, it's not good practice to leave such behavior within my HTML document, right? Instead, I actually want to put it within something in main.js. So currently I have this information here from when I was demonstrating the model or the DOM. I'm going to comment it out just so that it doesn't interrupt anything else. And I'm going to grab this function from index.html. I'm going to cut it out. And I'm going to bring it over to main.js. So now I have my show greeting function. Well, let's try to have our browser render this information again. Well, now my browser isn't recognizing this information because it's saying, hey, you try to trigger an onClick attribute for show greeting, but that doesn't exist. Why is that happening?
We need to link the main JavaScript file to the HTML file.
Right, they don't know about each other, right? Right now, our HTML document has no idea where this script is coming from. I have a script tag, but I haven't loaded it yet. Well, let's say that I call this through an href here. And I think it's an href. I may be wrong there. But let's go with main.js. Okay, now I refresh it, click on X-ray, and I click submit. And I don't think that is how we connect it. Oh, this is going to be embarrassing.
I think only reference. Why make it?
Sorry, Momo. You have to give me a second here.
It's SRC. For
Oh,
source.
it's source. Thank you. All right. Source. There you go. So now we can see hello world. That is coming from my main.js script. Right? I put console log hello world. Now we can see it showing up. And now if I put X-ray and I click submit, it says hello X-ray, just as expected before. All right. Now, there is a common issue that some developers run into. where some of their code is dependent on some information. So for example, let's say we're grabbing this ID output, all right? Well, if I were to say, hey, I want you to console.log the document dot get element by ID, and I pass in output. Well, now I'm gonna refresh this and you'll see that I get null, right? This function here is being executed. The log function is being executed. It's grabbing onto the console and executing where it's trying to grab a document, get element by ID of output. But that doesn't exist, right? When my header gets rendered, all of this the rest of my body hasn't been rendered yet. So when my script is triggered, it says, hey, this doesn't exist just yet. Well, how do I fix that? Well, I can actually add an attribute to the script tag called async defer. Now, when I add this attribute of async async defer, when I refresh, I actually get a paragraph tag with the ID of output being called. So what exactly is this async defer doing? Well, this async defer is saying, hey, we're going to read the script tag, but if at any point you hit something that doesn't exist yet, or you're trying to reference a document, but the document doesn't exist yet, I want you to pause. I want you to halt all of the functions that you're doing. So it comes down, gets to my script tag. Once it gets to my script tag, it goes into main.js and sees an executable function, console.log. But then my browser tells it, hey, this doesn't exist yet. This get element by ID output doesn't exist. So instead of JavaScript continuing to run from top to bottom, it halts. It pauses. While it pauses, my HTML document then renders my entire body. And once it finishes rendering my entire body, it then says to JavaScript, all right, you could pick up now. So now JavaScript tries again. It says document.getElementById by ID output. And now it's able to identify it and find it within my browser. All right. I see a question from Brandon.
Able to get the same functionality in line 8 with async defer as putting the script tag at the bottom of the body tag?
Yes, that is correct. If I wanted to, I could add a footer and I can move my async tag, or excuse me, my script tag, take off the async defer, and then that way, this is the very last thing that gets rendered by my browser is my script tag. All right, typically you want all of this to be at the top, which is the reason for the async defer to be common practice.
Okay, and that's something I can look into later then about why we would prefer that method over the footer method.
Yes, we'll be covering
Okay.
asynchronous functions later on.
Okay.
Eric?
I was aware of async and defer as individual attributes, but wasn't aware you can chain them together like that. Is there, I guess, preference to using async and defer versus just one or the other?
Yeah, so there definitely is. The difference between them, defer is saying, hey, wait till the end of the script gets executed. Asynchronous means there might be some functions here that need to happen at the same time that you're rendering my body. So you need to make sure you're paying attention, right? So defer, wait until I'm done rendering. Asynchronous is, hey, pay attention because some of these functions that are happening within this script tag are happening at the same time or need to happen at the same time we are rendering the body. Does that answer your question, Eric?
Yep, thanks.
Of course. Brandon?
So if you have functions that you need to run before the body gets rendered, would you just put them above wherever it stopped? Or like, let's say you have functions you need rendered before the body and then you have functions you need rendered after. How would you separate that? If it's async defer just completely stops JavaScript, if it finds a point where you can't keep going.
At that point, you would have two separate scripts, and then that's where you would unchain these. right? Defer would trigger the ones that need to be rendered once the body and everything in HTML is done. And asynchronous would be the ones that need to happen before and during,
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
of course. All right. And I think I'm missing a couple of questions here on the X-ray questions channel. I apologize. I see a couple of questions from Brandon. Is query selector found within the DOM? Is it a child, a document object? So they are not necessarily children to the document object. They are functions or methods that are built into the document model. I see another question saying, I saw a lot of event listeners that didn't know where pre-made, so that's where this question is drawing from. Yeah, there is a ridiculous amount of event listeners. They are on W3 schools, actually. I could send that source here on I just sent it and the X-ray questions. So if anybody's ever interested in looking into event listeners and the different functionality that's available for the DOM, you're more than welcome to scroll through each one of these attributes and try to put them into practice. And I see that Rich was actually able to answer that question. I apologize, Rich. Did that answer your question, Brandon, or did you have any follow-up to it?
Absolutely. I was yeah, that answers my question.
All right. Okay, great. So now that we've gone over a little bit of functionality here, before we start diving too deep into creating and altering text and actually interacting with our HTML document, let's go into how could we grab different HTML classes or HTML tags, depending on their classes, IDs, and query selectors. So here I'm within my division tag. I'm actually gonna divide this up. I'm gonna put a div here. And I'm gonna bring that down here. All right. So I just got rid of our first division tag here so that it won't display. We won't be interacting with it anymore. And now let's go ahead and actually make a couple of different division tags here for different query selectors. So I'm gonna grab a division. This division will have the ID of parent, but I'll give it the ID here shortly. But it's going to be the parent of 3 children divisions. All of these will have an ID. And only 3 of them will have a class. So here's my parent division. It is unique. It has 3 children. Each one of those children need to be divided by 1, 2, and 3. And now let's start grabbing some of this information. All right. We'll give us some real estate here so that we can start working with it. Let me go into main.js, add a little bit of design here. Oh, probably not all of the divs. Let's see here. Five VW might not be the best. let's do 15. That might do the trick. There you go. Now we got a bit of a more responsive thing going on here. Oh, maybe I think it's padding. Yeah, it is padding. All right, so now we can see what we've created. We got our parent division at the very top with 3 separate divs inside of it, right? So here's our child divisions and our parent div is right up top. Now let's start interacting with this document by changing some colors around and seeing what happens when we utilize different query selectors. Well, currently I have my async defer, so I don't have to worry too much about the different types of query selectors that I'm going to be utilizing and ensuring that they don't come up as none. The one that we've already seen so far is get element by ID, right? So let's do that. Let's console log document dot get element by ID, and let's grab the parent. Well, if I inspect, interesting. Is that not what I named it? Oh, I named it parent div. That might do the trick. All right, so we can see that returns to me the actual parent div, right? It's telling me all the padding. I was able to grab one specific parent. Well, just like I could grab elements by ID, we could also grab elements by class with a very strict change here. So notice before I said get element, which was only one was going to be returned by ID. Now here we're returning elements, meaning multiple, by a class name. That is one of the biggest reasons why ID should be unique and classes are for multiple. Now, when I return this class name and I go to child, what kind of property do we think we're going to get back? Or, excuse me, what kind of data type do we think is going to come back when I run this function? Oh, go ahead, Eric.
I was going to say maybe an HTML collection.
Yeah, an HTML collection, which is an array, right? That's awesome. Let's go ahead and run our child here. Well, now when it comes back, we get an HTML collection of 3, an array of 3 separate children. All right, so if I wanted to grab the very first one, I could say, hey, I only want index 0. Now that returns the first one. If I wanted to grab the second one, all I need to do is change my index names here. So there's my index of 2. Or excuse me, my index of 1. And there's my index of 2. I was able to grab each individual element, but all of it comes from an array of HTML elements. So there's get elements by class name and get elements by ID. Before I move on into our different selectors, are there any questions regarding the difference of get elements by class name and get elements by ID? All right, it doesn't look like there are any questions. So the next one that I'm going to move into here is going to be get elements by tag name. So just like before, I can say, hey, I want to get elements by tag names. And from here, I can specify that the tag that I want to grab is div. And it returns every single existing div within my HTML element. So we can take a look at the very top. This very first one up top, it's not showing up. It is our original display none function where our division up top that was containing a input field and a child division that was containing the output within children. So there we can see the output within children for the paragraph tag. So there's our first 2 divisions. Then we get our parent div, our child 1 div, and so on. So when I get elements by tag name, it returns a massive collection of all the different tag instances. All right. Now moving on to what's typically used, it's going to be the query selector. So we're going to go ahead and do get. Excuse me, it's not get. In this case, we're going to do query selector. I'm going to pass in a query. Well, you can see that it's already telling me, hey, you can grab things by the tag name. And there you go, just like before, it's going to return. Well, notice that I utilize query selector. So it's only returning one. It's returning the very first instance of said tag. All right, if I were to place input here, it would show the one that we put as display none. That's the very first instance of the tag. It's not returning the entire array. And I could do IDs, such as parent div. That will return to me the parent div. Now notice the way that I identified that it was an ID is the same way that I apply it in main CSS. Right? If I wanted to apply something to main CSS utilizing a color change, so if I were to do parent div, and I say background color is gray, well, that would gray out my parent div, right? And if I were to grab classes and say child divisions, I want their background colors to be blue, right? That's the same thing that we're applying to our query selectors. So if I wanted to grab the very first instance of one of the children, well, I can put dot child, and that would return the very first instance of the children. Now, what if I wanted to grab an array of these selectors? All I need to do is add the all at the very end. And rather than returning an HTML collection, it returns a node list. It's still returning an array of 3 indexes, each one with the class of child. This applies to tags. If I pass in div, rather than returning the very first instance, it's returning a list of all of the nodes, or excuse me, of all of the div tags that exist within my HTML document. Does anyone have any questions regarding query selector and query selector all? All right, if there aren't any questions, let's take our query selector capabilities to the next step, right? I'm going to go ahead and create a function for updating a color. So let's go ahead and come down here and say, hey, I want to update a color. So const update color. And this is going to take in my attribute name. That's all I'm going to pass in here. And then I'm going to say let element be equal to document dot get element by, and rather than get element by, I'm going to utilize query selector since that's going to be the most flexible. I'm going to pass in that attribute name. And then finally, I'm just going to say element dot style dot color. So now I'm adding some style attributes here. And I'm going to make that equal to, I don't know, let's go with red for now, just to keep it simple. So there's my function. Finally, I'm going to make a input field here, or excuse me, a button. I'm going to have it say change color. And then I'm going to call the function. So it's going to be an on-click function. I believe I named it update color. Good. So I'm going to come here, name it update color. So that's my function. And let's say the first attribute that I want to pass in there is going to be the parent div. Well, let's see what happens when I click on change color. Properties of null don't have a style for parent div. So my query my query selector seems to return nothing. So let's do a little bit of debugging here. Let's do a little bit of console.log for attribute name. And let's console.log the element as well. All right, so I am getting parent div as the attribute, but what could be the problem here? Anybody help me out? Go for it, Brandon. You're muted.
Declare on index.html. You could go over there real quick. Don't you need to declare update color passing in the hashtag? Doesn't need to
Awesome.
be hashtag parent div because you're calling a class or an ID, sorry.
Exactly. So I'm calling an ID, right? If I was utilizing get element by ID, this would work if I was just passing in the attribute name without the pound sign. But because I'm utilizing query selector, I need to actually pass in the marker that, hey, this is an ID. So now we refresh it. I click on change color and nothing happens. Why is nothing happening that time? Interesting. The first one was intentional. This one is not. Let's see. Console log element. Click on change color. It's grabbing the correct div. Oh, I apologize. I put color instead of background color. There you go. So now when I click on change color, it was actually able to change the attribute into red. All right, I'm applying some styling into my HTML document utilizing JavaScript. All right, this is going to be the end of part 1 of our lecture. At this point, does anyone have any questions over anything that we've covered up to now? Go ahead, Chris.
So I see a lot of functionalities between the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So what is a good practice to do what and where? Like you have JavaScript and HTML to do the button, but would you have JavaScript and JavaScript, CSS and CSS, and then HTML and HTML, and then call it somehow between each files? Is that good practice, or how would you? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie to you, Chris. I couldn't understand that question very well. Are you
Gotcha.
asking like what's the best practice as far as dividing the workload between JavaScript, HTML, and CSS?
Yes.
Got it. Yeah, so typically if you have a lot of behavior going on with JavaScript, I would just create multiple JavaScript scripts, each one with their own purpose, right? So if I was working on a massive project and let's say it was a workout application, one script is in charge of collecting data as far as different workouts that I have, right? One script is in charge of taking in the user input as workouts they've completed. Then there's one different script that's in charge for creating elements or making the site more dynamic. And each individual template that I have, or each index, currently I only have index HTML, right? But if I had multiple HTML pages, they should have their own CSS and JavaScript page, right? In addition to the original ones. So the original main CSS and main JS can extend to all templates, but any child template should have their own children main CSS and JavaScript script. Does that answer your question, Chris?
Yes. And my next question, are we gonna go over, since this is only one HTML page, some websites have multiple pages. Are we gonna do an example where we go to the next page?
Absolutely. Yes, we're going to be going into that later on.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Of course. Len? You're muted.
The double mute. Anyways, I want to kind of piggyback off what Chris just said and just kind of make sure that I have my head wrapped around this correctly. So you have your HTML, your CSS, you got your JavaScript, and then for a web page, you're going to have HTML files, CSS files, and JavaScript files. And to sub go there, like you have your main index, and your main index will have your CSS and your an index JavaScript. But if you have a like page 1 or page 2, that will also have its own JS file and possibly a CSS file, although I know from standards like they kind of say to make it look unique to kind of keep one CSS file. Am I sort of in the ballpark there?
Yes, that's definitely correct.
Thank you.
Of course. All right. I don't see any other questions in the X-ray questions channel, and it doesn't seem like we have any more hands up. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. All right. Now that we finished part 1 of our lecture, we're going to dive into manipulating the DOM, creating and inserting elements into the DOM utilizing JavaScript, and then we'll dive into a deep focus with event handlers. I think we had a question already. Momo, was that you? You're mute.
Yeah, I have a question because before I start getting down, am I supposed to be able to solve this assessment that gets a number in this 45 minutes? Get it done in 45 minutes?
You be able to get it done? Yes.
In the last 45 minutes?
Yes, in the last hour, the guess a number problem, that should be one function call.
Okay.
All
Okay.
right,
Thank you.
of course. All right, moving forward into our next portion of our lecture here, we're going to go ahead and start learning how to insert a new document or a new element into my index HTML. So let me go ahead and wrap all of this up in a parent division here. And I'm going to place that under display none as well. And actually, I could probably just take this button, move it up. All right. So now that we've emptied out our content, we could actually go into how we could insert some new HTML elements or remove some HTML elements. So currently I'm going to have this div. Going to name it container. And if anyone has a funny meme that they would like to be our container guest, please let me know. Let's go with angry cats here. If somebody can provide me an image URL to some angry cats, that would be fantastic. Oh, Brandon, did you have a suggestion?
I was not gonna do angry cats, but I have a different image.
Okay. Is it appropriate for a recording?
It's perfect. It's so perfect for the recording.
All right, let's see what we got here. Did you already send it in the chat?
I did, in fact.
All right. Scrolling down. Okay. All right. So there's our image URL that we're going to be working with to actually try to add some documents here. So let's just say we're going to write this as awesome code. All right. And my parent div should not have a height parameter. It doesn't have a width parameter either, but it is in display flex. So let me just go ahead and add a flex direction here of column and an align items center. All right, there you go. So there we have our awesome code block. And all we're going to do is we're going to create a function that will start adding individual pictures of this meme that we just saw there. Or maybe we could create a whole card in there that we could add. Well, let's go into index.html. Again, I'm going to add a button into my div. And actually, I'm going to make another parental div here. I'm just going to give this an ID of header. And I'm going to add a button. Say add image. And let me take off that. Extraction row. That should work for now. I don't really like how these two are touching each other. So I'm just gonna go ahead and give it a little bit of a margin, right? Okay, there you go. They're not touching anymore. Maybe 5BW may be good. There you go. All right, so there's our content. We currently have our awesome code. Every time I click on this add image button, I want there to generate an image right below. Cool. So let's go ahead and start doing it. So rather than having this as my container, I'm going to make a separate division here, and this will be my container. So that's where I'm going to start adding all of my images, and I expect them to go from left to right and utilize flex wrap to fall in some sort of containerized way. Great. Well, now I have this container, and I have this header and a little bit of information that we have so far. Now, if I were to utilize JavaScript to interact with this code, how could I hold one? I need this button to have a method so that when I click it, an image is being generated. And two, I need to build a function that will grab this div and start adding elements into it. So can anybody take a stab at helping me build out this template function? All right. Oh, go ahead, Molo.
Yeah, can I try with you? What do you want to do first? You want to make when we press the button, add image, so we can add attribute to the button.
Okay.
On click equal this function called the function. We didn't make the function yet, so we need to make the function.
Yeah, so let's just call add image.
Add image. Okay. And then we define function. This function let call it image at the equal document dot get the image. We give it get the we should access the container, right? Or to add the image, or
yeah, so we need to grab the container. So just like you said, we're gonna go ahead and grab the
the
container.
container. Yeah. So get the element by ID. Document dot get element by ID.
Mhm.
And we add the ID container. Right.
All right. Oh man.
I'm trying. I'm sorry.
Excuse me. Needed to sneeze real quick. All right. So there we go. We have a variable that we're going to be assigning our image to. We can grab our container and we set our onClick function. Oh, excuse me. We set our onClick function of add image. Great. Well, how do I actually add an image into this container? Well, let's go ahead and console.log container. And rather than just console logging container, I'm gonna console.log container.children. I'm gonna inspect my console here, click on this add image function, and we can see that it returns to me an HTML collection. Now, HTML collection, it's a fancy data type, but in reality, right, if I were to break it down bare bones, what is that? What kind of data type is that inside of JavaScript? Go ahead, Brandon.
It's an array.
Yeah, it's just an array, which means that I can append or push information into this array. So there's got to be some sort of special functionality for that, right? Now for this image part, and actually let's leave that for now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab container dot append child. Just like a container has children, there is a function called append child. And for this append child, well, it expects an HTML element, right? Currently, I don't have any to append into it.
So the image element should be created.
Yeah, so the image element needs to be created, right? So I'm going to go ahead and say let image is equal to, and at this point, I'm not going to need my index HTML anymore. So let's give us some more room here. Document.create element, and the element that I want to create is an image tag. Well, now let's console log image. Well, now when I click on here on add image, we can see that an image tag is being generated. All right, so there I have an image tag. Well, now just like in HTML I would have an image with a source attribute set to some sort of icon, and then it would be a self-closing tag, right? I could also add a little bit of styling, where let's say my style says the width is set to 50% of the parent container, and the height is also set to 50% of the parent container. And actually, percentages might not be the best thing here. Let's just go with 5VW and 5VW. This is getting a little bit into responsive web design. I'm just demonstrating it. We're not going to cover much of what these sizes are doing. VW just stands for view width. So the view width of my current browser. All right, so there's what I want to render. An image with the source with a specific width. Well, now all of these are just attributes or properties that belong to the object of image, right? Because image is an object. It is now an HTML tag that can be referenced to as an object in JavaScript. So how could I add these attributes to the image tag? Momo?
It's suggestion and question at the same time. Shall we make this element in the HTML file and just add the source of the image?
I mean, you
I'm-
can't, but that's not the purpose of this.
Mhm. So we need to put the, yeah. We need to put the source of the image.
Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and grab my image variable here, right?
Yeah.
It's
Equal.
already an HTML tag. You're saying to set it to equal? Okay. What am I equaling it to?
No, it should be in the same form, like in the commented line number 6, right?
What
No,
about?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm sorry. No. I tried.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you. So we're going to grab our object, right? Which is image. I am then going to grab the property of source. And I could now set that property. I can grab my image and grab the property of style. And then from there, I can grab the width and set that to 5VW. Same thing, I can grab the image, go into style, and then grab the property of height and set that to 5VW. Right, so now we took our image tag here and we have generated an image, set the source equal to a pound sign, with the width and height style attributes of 5 view width. Good. So now that I'm done designing or creating my HTML element, I can go to my container and append the child of image. Let's take a look at what happens then. Now you can see that as I'm appending my child, it is growing within that division. And that is not what I wanted to do. It doesn't seem like I have container, so I'm gonna grab that here. All right. So there we can see our image attributes, right? They're all falling in a row, and I have a couple of them coming under. They're all in display flex. And as I click, more and more images are going to be generated and placed into that secondary row. All right, so now we're creating HTML elements, and we are creating them and then also appending them into our division of a container. All right, at this point, does anyone have any questions over how to interact with HTML utilizing JavaScript and adding it into your HTML template? Okay, it doesn't seem like there are any questions. So if there are any questions, currently right now my image source is set to a £, but we do have this handy dandy image source that was shared to us by, I believe this was Brandon Yo. So now let's change that into our HTML tag. And now when I add it, oh, it looks like that 5VW isn't really cutting the cheese. Let's go ahead and make it a little bit bigger. There you go. Now we can start seeing we're getting our rows and our meme is getting added over and over again into our HTML template. Again, I'm going to open up the floor for questions now. Does anyone have any questions over how to add elements, HTML elements into your document utilizing JavaScript? Momo?
Yeah, in the assignment, I noticed a function called add event listener, and it passed 2 arguments to this. We're supposed to be this here in the script.
Yeah, we're going to be getting into that here shortly. We haven't gone over events just yet.
Okay, thank you.
All right, doesn't seem like there are any other questions. Again, when you grab a container or some sort of element, they have children. You can append a child, and this create element tag is not limited to just an image. Any HTML tag that can be rendered by HTML can also be created through create element in the document model. All right, so let's move on into our events now. I'm gonna come back over here. At this point, I think our code is starting to get a little messy, so I have maybe this display none isn't cutting the cheese anymore. I may have to just comment it all out, or at least give myself a little bit of real estate in between lines. All right. Well, now let's start talking about how I could add a couple of event listeners here. Now we've already seen an event happen. The event that we've seen so far is going to be on click. But now there's a couple of other events that we can add, such as mouse over. There's there's a ton of events. So let's concentrate over mouse over and mouse out, right? All we're gonna do is we're gonna create a small deck of cards. And with this deck of cards, I'm gonna go ahead and when I hover over them, they color yellow. When I move out, they're just gonna be built back into an into a transparent background. So here we go. I'm gonna have an ID of card holder. And here I'm gonna go ahead and create 6 different, actually, let's go with 4 different cards here. Gonna give him a card attribute. All right, so there we go. We have 4 cards. Gonna come over to main.css. We'll comment out all of this stuff so it doesn't get in our way now. And I'm just gonna enter my card holder. Gonna put this on display flex. I'm going to justify the content to be space around. Gonna line item center. I'm going to make the width 100% of my view width. And I'm going to make, I'm not gonna worry about the height actually. But we should have a border just so we can visualize it. So let's do our border. Black, dashed, and we have 1 pixel. All right, so there you go. That's what we have here. Here's our little element so far. Let's start getting into the actual cards. I just want to make sure I did name it card and not cards. All right. So there's my card. Again, I'm going to add a width of, and let's make this 5 VW. Let's make the height 10 VW. And let's make a display flex, justify content center, align item center, and finally we need a border. Oh, it's a little too much. Let's go ahead and do 10 and do 20 here. All right, so there's our cards. There's our cards being nicely formatted. We see 1, 2, 3, and 4. They're all existing, but now we want to add some actual events into these divisions, all right? So let's go ahead and add an event to these divisions utilizing our, well, first we're going to actually add them straight into index.html, and then I'll show how to create them and add the event within JavaScript. All right, so let's go ahead and say that we want to do a mouse over, right? Ooh, looks like this one might be unique to JavaScript. So const, we're going to go ahead and insert a card here. Now, the way this is going to work is I'm going to create a division. So I'm going to say, let new div, I'm going to make that equal to document.create element div. All right, so there we have our division, just like we had before. Now I'm just going to go ahead and give it a class. So new div dot class name. And that's going to be equal to card, like the card I had just created. Great. I don't have to worry about the inner HTML. Actually, I guess I could add a counter. New div dot inner HTML, and let's change that to inner text. Be equal to counter, and then counter plus plus. All right, so there we have our cards being generated. Yeah, we already went over all the CSS and what that would look like. So the CSS doesn't really matter. Now that we have our cards, we're creating our card. The counter will keep track of each individual number. Now let's go ahead and add an event to this. So I'm going to grab my new division. And I'm going to add an event listener. Now, this event listener is kind of like the mapping function. It takes in a function. First, I have to say, well, what event are we doing? All right, so let's say I'm going to do mouse over. Well, when my mouse moves over this card, I want the new div dot background color, or excuse me, dot style dot background color to be equal to yellow. All right. Now, you'll see the example in the curriculum gets into a lot of math stuff. I'm typically not a fan of overcomplicating the simplistics. So I want to make sure that we understand this before we start messing around with anything in map, right? So I have a new division. I am adding an event listener to it. That event listener is going to be when my mouse fluts over. When that event is triggered, it is then going to grab the new division, the style attribute, and set it to yellow. Okay, finally, I'm going to grab that card holder. So I'm going to say, let card holder be equal to document.object, oh, excuse me, get elements by ID. This is my card holder. I'm going to append a child for new div, which is just my card. All right. Gonna put my button here. I'm gonna say add card. It's going to have an on-click function. And I believe what we named it was insert card. Great. So I'm going to name it insert card. All right. So now when I click on it, we can see cards are being generated. My counter is working correctly. All right. Oh, and as you can see, when I hover over the mouse, my mouse over event is now being triggered. And it's changing the color of each card. Well, that's good to know, but that's the very top level of what's happening here, right? How is it even recognizing that the event is happening? Well, let's go over to main.js. In main.js, I passed this event argument, but I never utilized it. Well, let's take a look at what event looks like. I'm going to start adding a couple of cards here. I need to make sure I don't hover over them. Let's take a look at our console. Well, when I hover over the card, there you go, I get a mouse over event was triggered. Now it's telling me this event was trusted, and it's telling me screen X and screen Y. And it gives me some sort of number coordinated next to it. What do we think that means? Screen X and screen Y. Go for it, Mickey.
Basically your coordinates on the screen.
Yeah, exactly. It's telling me where my mouse was on the screen that triggered this event. It gives me another couple of different behaviors that happen to event. You can see that it's telling me there's such a thing as pagex. There's a movement, a couple of different layers. But my event is actually also telling me what type. And if I take a look at the target, it tells me what exactly is triggering this event, right? So if I don't want to look at the entire thing, I could say, hey, I want you to tell me the target where this location happened. So now I click on add event, right? Or add card, that creates my card. When I hover over it, not only does it trigger my event, but this console.log or event.target is telling me this is exactly where that happened. Not only is it telling me that, but it's giving me the entire object of the div tag. So I could even grab information such as dot enter text. When I hover over it and I come over, it's telling me 1, 2, and 3. There's 10, 9, 6, 8, because it's telling me the inner text attribute of where that event was triggered. All right, before I move on to our second event, which is mouse out, does anyone have any questions over events, the target attribute of said event, and how you can add an event listener through JavaScript to an HTML tag? Go for it, Eric.
So in the MDN docs that are part of the curriculum, it says don't do inline JavaScript for event handling. It says it's bad practice. Are you showing us this just to show that it's possible and make it easier for showing us the connection, or is there more of a reason behind it from your side?
Yeah, there's definitely more of a reason behind it. So just to clarify, this is not, this is, excuse me, this is more of the preferred method, right? You want to actually add events utilizing JavaScript rather than putting it inside of index.html. Now, why would I want to do that? Later on, once we start working within the React framework, you're going to see that the only thing that gets rendered onto the browser, or the only thing that's actual HTML, is one file called index.html. And that file only has a body tag. And that body tag is calling to a JavaScript file that is compiling all of the other different files that are within your React framework, grabbing all that code, turning it into just regular JavaScript as if it were vanilla JavaScript that I'm writing now, and then connecting it to that HTML file. So your entire application is actually being rendered through pure JavaScript instead of HTML. Does that answer your question, Eric?
I don't know if it does. Could you go over to the index HTML real quick? And sorry
Yeah.
if I'm taking time on this.
No
So
problem.
in your line 37, you have button on click equals insert card. What I'm asking is, does it make more sense to do like a document.query selector, select your button in your JavaScript file, and then add that insert card click event listener like only in your JavaScript file, not on the HTML here?
Got it. Okay. So when it comes to that question specific, I think that's more design oriented. I would stick to the, I don't want to say KISS. Well, yeah, it would be KISS, right? Of keep it simple. If all I'm doing is calling a function and adding an on-click listener, then I would set it here. But if I'm dealing with something that's a lot more complicated and that's going to be repetitive code. So for example, this is just one button, right? But if each one of these had a behavior that I wanted them to trigger every time I click on them, then I would write it within my main.js so that every time one is created, that event listener is created with it.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Of course. All right. I don't see any other questions, so let's just do a quick review of what we have so far. In index.html, I have my add card button, and there I have a div called card holder. in main JavaScript, I take my function insert card, which is what's being triggered by that on click. Insert card creates a division element. It gives it a class name of card. And we do that so that we could apply this styling here. All right, give it the class name of card. I then set its inner text to counter so that each time a card is made, we can have a new number being displayed into it. We then set a new division. So my card now has a mouse over event. So every time I hover over a card, this event is triggered. We console.log that event as of right now, but I'm actually going to comment that out. But this event attribute or this event parameter here actually grabs the event. It can tell me the target where this event originated from. It can tell me the exact location. And there's a couple of other attributes that will become useful as we start diving into React that come with that event. We then grab our new division, set the style attribute of background color to yellow. We then grab the card holder and append a child into its children. So I'm going to grab, there you go. So I clicked on it. It created the HTML element with the event listener and then added it to the card holder. All right. Well, now, right now they're highlighted in yellow. What if I wanted them to do something when I hover back out, right? I don't want them to stay in yellow. Well, now I can say, hey, I want my new division to also have a separate event listener. Now I'm passing in 2. And this one is going to say mouse out. Well, when my mouse moves out, again, I'm going to catch the event. So this is a function that takes in a function. And what I wanted to do is I could even grab the event.target rather than just calling the new division again. I know that it comes from the event. And I can set its background color. And let's just say gray to show that I have actually hovered over it. Well, I add a card. I'm gonna add a bunch of them here. When I hover over one, it turns yellow. And when I hover out, oh, it didn't get triggered. New division, mouse out. Let's see. Okay, so it is holding out, but when I try to turn the background color to gray, it doesn't seem to be doing it. Oh, there you go. I missed that style attribute. There it is. All right, so now we can see that they're turning gray. If I continue to add a bunch of them and I go from left to right, currently they're all transparent, yellow. You can see they're all turning gray. If I start working backwards, well, they start turning yellow again and go back to gray. And now I have my image effect. A dynamic site is now being implemented with some dynamic styling depending on the user behavior. All right. Does anyone have any questions over event listeners, how to add event listeners or manipulate event listeners? All right, I don't see any questions on the X-ray channel or any questions here. So let's go into working with forms. And this is actually going to be the last part. Oh, excuse me. No, it's not. We have this and then event propagation. So let's go into working with forms inside of JavaScript. All right, so here I'm going to have my div. This is gonna have an ID of form folder. It's going to take in my form, which will have an input of type text. And a placeholder saying insert, let's just say Pokemon. And then finally, I'm gonna have an input type submit with a placeholder of submit. All right, so there you go. I have my insert Pokemon. I have a button of insert type submit. Well, currently, if I should probably add a name attribute here. So now if I put Pikachu in there and I put submit, we can see that a parameter is being sent over where it's grabbing Pokemon is equal to Pikachu. Pokemon being the name that I gave the form, and Pikachu being the value that was passed into the form. And this is being submitted and refreshed. That's the important part that we need to understand. When I click on submit, my browser is refreshing the site. All right, I can put Pikachu and it's refreshing the site. It's sending a new request to index.html and it's re-rendering the entire application all over again. So that's the default behavior of my form here. But now how do I work with it, right? How could I grab information out of this form and have it actually input something into my browser? Well, let's create another function here called handle submit. Now this function is going to take in an event again. And for now, let's just say console log hello. Now here's my console. When I click on submit, nothing's happening. Well, let's go over to index.html and actually connect this function. Let's say on submit, I want you to trigger handle submit. All right, so let's do this again. Go to Pikachu, I click on submit. Well, nothing populated. Now, if we pay close attention to the console here, we'll see that something actually does populate for just a split second. All right, just a split second, we saw hello there. If I click on submit, we'll see it come back and then it goes away. Now, why is that happening? Well, it's happening because a new request is being sent out. We're no longer within just my regular form. A new request is being sent out to grab information and it refreshes my entire page. Well, that's happening because of my event. So the way to stop this from happening is I can grab my event, which is an on-submit event, and I can say, I want to prevent your default behavior. Whatever your default behavior is, I don't want you to do that anymore. Let's see, that is handling event. Let me refresh it here. Okay, that seems to be causing some weird error. Interesting. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the port. It could be live server just acting up. Let me make sure I save my function here. Oh, it's still refreshing the browser. Shouldn't be refreshing the browser anymore. I'm gonna have to go back and figure out what exactly is going on here as to why it's not stopping. Let's see. Oh, there you go. I'm not passing in the event itself. All right, so I need to pass in the event itself as a parameter in order for JavaScript to be able to grab it. Interesting. So now I put Pikachu, I click on submit. There is no refresh of the browser. If I put console.log value, oh, excuse me. Hello. And I go ahead and put Pikachu and I submit, nothing's gonna happen. There's no refreshness of my browser. It's all being reloaded, or excuse me, it's not being reloaded. It's just calling the function over and over again. So a form's default behavior is to refresh my browser and send that information and ask for a new request while I'm stopping that behavior with event.prevent default. And I am then specifying the behavior as to how this should be handled. We're going to dive a little bit more into forms here shortly, but does anyone have any questions over how we're stopping the default behavior of a form? Okay, so we're stopping the default behavior of the form. Now, how do we grab the content out of this form, right? Well, this form data is being sent. Now, I could do something really janky and give this input field some sort of ID to be able to grab the element by ID and then take its value. Sure, and that may work, but that's not really the proper way of handling it. Instead, JavaScript hands us this new class in JavaScript called form data. So I'm going to say const form data is equal to new form data. And the form that we're going to pass in is the one triggering the event. So I'm going to pass in event.target. Well, let's take a look at what that looks like now. Let's console.log form data. Again, I put Pikachu in there. I submit. And we get a form data dictionary that is a prototype. And it has a couple of different attributes in there. Now, it doesn't really give me much. So there's probably a better way that I can read this, right? Well, I can say const form props. I'm just going to name this one prop so I can see the difference between them. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn that form data structure into a object utilizing from entries and pass in form data. Well, now let's console.log form props. We put in Pikachu, we submit, and now we get the name of a key. So here's the name, which was Pokemon. It is now being interpreted as a key. And the value being Pikachu, which is the value that was passed into the input field. If I were to change that back into Charizard, and I click on submit, well, we would get a different dictionary, the same key of Pokemon with the value of Charizard now as the input field. So we grab the data, we turned it into a new instance of the class form data, and we pass in the form altogether. This formats it for us, but it's not readable just yet. We then turn it into an object utilizing object from entries. We pass in the class instance, and that returns an object that we can actually manipulate. Well, now finally, let's go ahead and have our p tag here. I'm going to give this an ID of output. And I'm just going to say document.objects, or excuse me, document.get element by ID. I'm going to grab output. I'm going to say that the inner text is equal to form props dot Pokemon. All right. Come over, I grab Pikachu, I submit. So this seems to be failing for some reason. It likely didn't grab my output by ID. Well, this may need to be put into different steps here. So we'll say let P, and let's console.log that P tag real quick, just to make sure it's working. Okay, so it's grabbing that P tag. Nope. All right, scroll. And let's finally say inner text is equal to form props dot Pokemon. This should work. If it doesn't, it might be the way I'm accessing the document there, or excuse me, the props. So I'm gonna go ahead and console.log that P tag one more time. Okay, so it's saying that the P tag is there. But it's not showing me it. Go ahead, Brandon.
Give it a display type of none.
Did I give it a display tag of none? I thought I commented all that out. Yeah, it's
Div style display none. Just move the p tag out of that. The display none, and it should work.
yeah. Let's get mess up our notes, but I should be able to just comment it. Let's see. There you go. Yeah, I was grabbing the wrong ID. I apologize. There's a good lesson as to why your ID shouldn't ever be repeated inside the same HTML file. All right. So now I created a form. This form has a submit handler, which is happening on submit. It is taking in the event as a parameter. This form has an input field that has a name, and it's important to establish a name because if you don't, you're not going to get a dictionary, or excuse me, an object out of it, right? In JavaScript, I am then preventing the default behavior of this form. I am passing in the form into the form data class to create an instance of form data. That turns it into an instance of a class, but it's not readable to me, kind of like how in Python, when you created the class, it was just a memory location. Well, then I create it into an entries or into an actual object. And that's what gives me this name of Pokemon, which comes in from the name attribute inside of my input field and the value of what was inputted into the field itself. I then grab the P tag and I set its inner text to form props, which is my object, dot Pokemon, which is the key of Pokemon. And that's how we get the value being inputted into that outside. So now if I just put hello, hello also populates. All right. Does anyone have any question regarding working with forms? I heard a hand go up, but then it came, oh, Cody?
Yeah, so how does it know that it's on that button click for this one as opposed to any event that happens? Say you have like 2 buttons or something like that.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So this is not a button. It looks like a button, but it is not a button. It's styled like a button by the browser, or more because of the input type. I turned it in an input type submit. Now this still belongs to the form. Both of these input fields belong to the form itself. The form has an onSubmit method saying, hey, once I get submitted or once everything is done being filled out, you're going to trigger this function. So this here doesn't have an onClick method. Instead, it's submitting the form. I could do the same thing by pressing enter on my browser, or excuse me, on my keyboard. By pressing enter on my keyboard, I am submitting this form, which then triggers the onSubmit method. By clicking on this button, I am submitting this form, which triggers the onSubmit method. Does that answer your question, Cody?
Okay, so you're submitting it. What if you have like another submit or so my question is that on event, when that event is triggered, is that on every single event that happens on this form that you're going to where's the other in the main.js? Yeah, where it says at the top, where it says event prevent default. So you're preventing the default. Is that for every single event that will occur on this form?
No, that is only for the event that's being passed in. And the event that I'm passing in is the submission of the form.
Oh, you're calling it by handle form submit event. Okay, sorry, I missed that. All right.
Yeah, no problem at all. Rojan?
So I was wondering on line 35 on the handle form submit, where do you get the argument event from?
Yeah, so the argument event or the parameter event is happening from the submit method. Any of these event listeners, such as onSubmit or mouse over or anything like that, whenever they're triggered, they're going to automatically attempt to pass in event. If the function that's being rendered accepts the event, then great, it passes it in and it works correctly. If it doesn't handle for the event, it just says, oh, okay, you don't want it? Well, then I'll just keep it to myself. Now,
So, oh, sorry.
when you pass it in, that's what gives me the ability to work with the event within my function. That's why I was getting that error earlier. I had event here as a parameter, and I was trying to prevent the default behavior, but I was not passing it into my function from the onSubmit method. Go ahead.
So,
Yeah.
so the event word is like a reserved word for that in there, or like can you change that to a different word and it will still work?
Yeah, no, this here, from this side, this is a reserved word. If I hover over it, it tells me, hey, this is specifically an event class instance. All right.
Okay.
Awesome.
Okay. All right, that makes sense. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? Let me try to do something weird here. I wonder what happens if I just put R. Yeah, if I put R as any, and so yeah, event is what declares this as an event instance. All right. Okay, it doesn't seem like there are any questions regarding forms. So the very last thing we have to go into today is going to be event propagation. So now to do that, and we are starting to run out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and take some code straight from our curriculum here. And I'll pass it into our X-ray questions channel, just in case somebody is following along and needs it. All right, so here we go. We have this div here, and we can see that it has a ID of say hello. When I click it, and then I have another ID of say hello, and actually I don't really like the way this is formatted. So oh, great. All right. Okay, good. So now everything has been formatted correctly. We have our divs. We have a parent division, and then we have a bunch of children division. Let me go ahead and give it a little bit of some styling so that we could see the differences here. All right, so there you go. We can see a little bit of the differences here of what we have going on. And if I take a look at index.html, it seems like we have a couple of functions being rendered there. We see we have an inner and an outer layer, and we have a couple of divisions. Well, let me go to main.js here, and I'm going to add this say hello functions. So we have say hi and say hello. Again, I'm going to pass these over in the X-ray questions channel. There, say hi and say hello. Both of these take in an event, and we can see hello from inner, or excuse me, hello from outer and hi from inner. And if I take a look at index.html, well, say hi comes from the inner division, while say hello comes from the outer division. Now, this all looks pretty straightforward, but there's a bit of a problem. So here's my outer division. All right, the one hovering outside, that should say hello when I click on it. Okay, and I see hello outer. Great. Well, now what happens when I click on this second division class? Well, when I click on this second division class, it still gives me hello outer. Well, not really a problem as of right now, right? But what happens if I want unique events to happen at each layer? Right? My outer layer shouldn't be triggered when I click on my inner layer. So for example, when I click on my first division, I see both functions being called. I see hi inner and hi outer being called and being demonstrated, right? That shouldn't be happening. The only thing that I should see is hi inner, meaning that I am isolating the event that's being triggered to only one division, not multiple layers stacked on top of each other. So how do I fix that? Well, this is called event propagation. And the way you fix it is by just calling event stop propagation. Now you do this from the smallest or the innerest layers possible, right? So if the one that I want to isolate is the very first, or excuse me, the second layer, which is this is the first division, well, I would say I want to enter event and I want to stop propagation. Well, now let's take a look at it. When I click on my outer, I still get hello outer. When I click on this second division, I still get hello outer, and that's okay, because if I take a look at index.html, the second and third division don't have an inner event happening, right? They're just division classes. Well, what happens when I click on this is the first division now? Now I only get hi inner, and that's because the event within the inner class gets triggered. It stops the propagation saying, hey, if there's anybody else attached to me, don't worry about it. This doesn't pertain to you. This is only my event that's being triggered. And when I click on the outer, I only get hello outer. And that's event propagation. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding event propagation? Doesn't seem like there are any questions. So let's go over what we covered today. So today we covered what is the JavaScript DOM, writing JavaScript within HTML. We covered the steps for the browser as far as building our document model. We went over connecting an external JavaScript file, the different forms of query selectors, the onClick attribute, creating and inserting HTML elements with JavaScript, events, event propagation, and working with HTML forms in JavaScript. At this point, does anyone have any questions over any of the topics that were covered today? All right, if there aren't any questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.